I spent 33 years believing I was broken. My mother made sure of it. She forgot my birthdays. She hid my college acceptance letters. She whispered to every man who loved me, "She's damaged goods. Mental illness runs in her blood. It's genetic." One by one they left. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. I built my life anyway, brick by brick, rejection by rejection, until I became the youngest VP at my company. I thought maybe finally she'd see me. Instead, she grabbed the microphone at my promotion party. In front of my colleagues, my boss, everyone who respected me. "You all think she's so successful," she announced, her voice dripping with poison. "But I know what she really is. Damaged goods. Always has been." The room went silent. 40 pairs of eyes turned to me. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I reached into my purse, pulled out a thin envelope, and said, "Now it's my turn to tell the truth." What I read next made my mother go pale, and my father burst into tears. My name is Vanessa Lowe. I'm 35 years old, a newly promoted vice president at a financial consulting firm in Boston, and until recently, I believed my mother simply didn't know how to love me. I was wrong. She knew exactly what she was doing. Growing up, I wasn't the child who got hit. I was the child who got erased. My younger brother Tyler brought home C's and received applause at the dinner table. I brought home A's and received silence. When Tyler turned 10, my mother threw him a party with a bouncy castle, 20 friends, and a 3-tier cake. When I turned 10, she forgot entirely. I sat at the kitchen table that morning, waiting for someone to say happy birthday. No one did. When I finally reminded her that evening, she looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "Some people just aren't worth celebrating, Vanessa." I told myself she was stressed. I told myself she loved me in her own way. I made excuses for her my entire childhood because the alternative was too painful to accept. But looking back now, I can see the pattern I was too young to recognize then. Every achievement I earned was quietly sabotaged. I made the varsity volleyball team sophomore year, and somehow my uniform got lost the week before our first game. I won a regional writing contest, and no one from my family came to the ceremony because my mother scheduled a dentist appointment for Tyler that same afternoon. I was nominated for homecoming court senior year, and suddenly we had a family trip planned for that exact weekend. The biggest sabotage, though, I wouldn't discover until decades later. Senior year, I applied to Stanford, Berkeley, and Columbia. I had the grades, I had the essays, I had the recommendations. I never heard back from any of them. I assumed I simply wasn't good enough. So I went to a state school, worked twice as hard as everyone around me, graduated at the top of my class, and clawed my way up the corporate ladder one rejection at a time. I told myself the path didn't matter, only the destination. I was wrong about that too. The first crack in my mother's carefully constructed world appeared when I was 16. I was looking for my passport in her filing cabinet when I found a birth certificate. My birth certificate. But the mother's name wasn't Margaret Lowe. It was Helen Porter. When I asked my mother about it, she slapped me across the face. It was the only time she ever hit me. "Don't ever go through my things again," she hissed. At 18, I tried to find more. I searched online and found an obituary for Helen Porter, who died after a brave battle with illness. When I asked my father for details, his face went white. That night, my mother found my search history. She didn't yell. She just looked at me and said, "Keep digging and you'll find yourself without a roof over your head. I'll make sure no college takes you. Try me." I was about to start school. I couldn't afford to be homeless, so I stopped asking. I buried the question for 17 years and told myself the past didn't matter. Now standing in my apartment, I stare at the guest list for my promotion party. I almost didn't invite my family. But some foolish part of me still hopes that this time, finally my mother will look at me and say she's proud. There's one person at work who makes all of this bearable. James Parker from Legal. We're not close, but he always says good morning like he means it. Once when I was working late, he left a coffee on my desk with a note that said, "Whatever it is, you've got this." I still have that note in my drawer. I don't know why I kept it. I spent 35 years believing my mother's cruelty was random. Bad moods, stress, just how she was. That night I would learn it was never random. It was a plan. And I was never supposed to escape it. The night of my promotion party, I stood at the entrance of the venue and watched two worlds collide. On one side, my colleagues arrived in good spirits, shaking my hand, patting my shoulder, telling me I deserved this. My boss, Richard, had already given a short speech calling me indispensable to the team. On the other side, my family walked through the door and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Margaret scanned the venue with barely concealed irritation, her eyes moving across the decorations, the catering, the well-dressed professionals who had gathered to celebrate me. Tyler shuffled in behind her, hands in his pockets, muttering something about how I always had to show off. My father looked uncomfortable from the moment he stepped inside, like a man waiting for a bomb to go off. He kept glancing between Margaret and me, his shoulders tense, his smile forced. For the first hour, I tried to keep the two worlds separate. I introduced my family to a few colleagues, kept conversations brief, and moved between groups like a diplomat navigating hostile territories. James Parker caught my eye from across the room at one point and gave me a small nod of encouragement. That simple gesture steadied me more than he probably knew. But I noticed something strange as the evening went on. Every time a colleague congratulated me, Margaret's jaw tightened. Every time someone praised my work ethic or my leadership, her grip on her wine glass grew harder. This wasn't the look of a proud mother struggling to express herself. This was fear. And I didn't understand why until the moment that changed everything. A colleague named Patricia walked up to my father with a warm smile. She didn't know our family history. She didn't know the landmines she was stepping on. She just said cheerfully, "Your daughter is remarkable, Mr. Lowe. She must get it from her mother." My father's face did something I had never seen before. It flickered with pride, real pride. And underneath it, pain, deep old pain that he couldn't hide fast enough. Margaret saw it. I watched her watching him, and I saw something in her snap. After 33 years of trying to erase a ghost, she had just watched her husband's face light up at the mention of his first wife. In that moment, all her control crumbled. When the MC invited family members to say a few words, Margaret was already moving toward the microphone before anyone else could react. She took it from the stand with the confidence of a woman who had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Her voice was sweet poison as she addressed the room. "You all think Vanessa is so successful, but I raised her. I know what she really is." She paused, letting the silence build. "She's damaged goods, always has been. It's in her blood. No man can stand her for long. No success will last. Trust me, I've seen it all before." The room went dead silent. 40 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. I could feel their shock, their pity, their confusion. My boss's face had gone pale. Patricia looked horrified. And Margaret stood there with a small smile, as if she had finally won a battle she had been fighting for decades. I didn't cry. I was done crying for this woman. Standing there in that frozen silence, memories I had tried to bury came flooding back. I thought about Daniel, my first real love. I was 23 when we met. He was kind, patient, and talked about our future like it was certain. After he met my family for dinner, he vanished. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. I spent months wondering what I had done wrong. Years later, a mutual friend told me the truth. Margaret had pulled Daniel aside that night and told him I had inherited mental illness from my birth mother. She said Helen had been institutionalized before she died. She said it was genetic, that any children we had would be at risk. And then she added the most manipulative part of all. She told Daniel not to say anything to me because I was in denial about my condition. She said confronting me would only trigger an episode. Daniel thought he was protecting me by leaving quietly. He wasn't cruel. He was manipulated by a woman who had perfected her lies over decades. Then there was Marcus. I was 28 when he proposed. I said yes. I thought I had finally found my happiness. But after one dinner with my family, everything changed. He came to me with a strange question. "Is there anything about your family's medical history I should know?" I thought he meant heart disease or diabetes. I said no. He looked at me for a long time with something sad in his eyes, then returned the ring without explanation. I didn't understand until years later that he was giving me a chance to tell him the truth. But how could I correct a lie I didn't know existed? Margaret hadn't just stolen my childhood. She had stolen every chance I had at love. 6 months before this party, we had another fight. I don't even remember what started it. But in the heat of her anger, Margaret said something she couldn't take back. "You think you belong in this family? You were never one of us. You were just something your father dumped on me." That night, I ordered a DNA test online. When the results arrived 3 weeks before the party, I didn't open them right away. But I started carrying the envelope with me everywhere. In my purse, in my briefcase, in my coat pocket. Not because I had a plan, but because every time I touched it, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The truth was in my hands, and I could open it whenever I chose. For the first time in my life, I had something Margaret couldn't take from me. I had planned to show it to my father privately after the party. I wanted to ask him calmly about Helen Porter. I wanted the truth, without the drama. Margaret just moved up the timeline. She set down the microphone with a triumphant smile, looking at me like she expected me to crumble. Like she expected me to run out of the room in tears, proving to everyone that I really was the broken thing she had always claimed I was. Instead, I walked to my table. I reached into my purse. I pulled out the thin envelope I had been carrying for 3 weeks, and I spoke clearly enough for everyone in that silent room to hear. Thank you, Mom, for that introduction. Now let me share some truth of my own. I looked directly at Margaret. Her smile faltered. You turned my workplace into your stage, I said. I'm just finishing the performance you started. When I opened that envelope, my hands were steady. I had spent 33 years shaking. That night, it was finally her turn. I pulled the papers from the envelope and let the room see them. My voice came out calm, almost gentle, even though my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I did a DNA test 3 weeks ago, I said, not to find out who I am. I've always known who I am. I did it to confirm what I've suspected since I was 16 years old. I held up the results so everyone could see the official letterhead that charts the proof. This test matched me with relatives I've never met. People with the last name Porter, Helen Porter's family. I paused to let that sink in. But here's what's interesting. I share 0 genetic relatives with anyone from Margaret's family. None. Not a single cousin, aunt, or distant relative on her side. I looked directly at Margaret. Her face had gone completely white. You're not my mother, you never were. Gasps rippled through the room. I heard someone behind me whisper, Oh my God. Margaret's hands were shaking as she pointed at me. You're lying. That proves nothing. Those tests are wrong all the time. I shook my head slowly. It proves everything. Combined with the birth certificate I found when I was 16, the one that lists Helen Porter as my mother, there is only one explanation. You've been lying to everyone, including me, for 33 years. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice melting in someone's abandoned drink. I turned to my father, who had collapsed into a chair. Tears were streaming down his face, but he wasn't trying to hide them anymore. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath underwater for decades and was finally being allowed to surface. Dad, I said, you've known all along. Who was Helen Porter? And how did she really die? He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at me with those wet eyes, his whole body trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked on every word. Helen was my first wife, your real mother. He had to stop and take a breath. She died of ovarian cancer when you were 2 years old, not mental illness. She was never sick in her mind, Vanessa. She was the strongest, clearest person I ever knew. She loved you more than anything in this world. I felt something shift inside me. All those years of being told I was damaged. All those relationships destroyed by whispered lies. All that shame I carried for a condition I never had inherited from a mother who was never sick. I turned back to Margaret. You told every man I ever loved that my mother was mentally ill, that it was genetic, that I was damaged goods. My voice was steady, but I could feel the rage building underneath. You didn't just lie about me. You slandered a dead woman who can't defend herself, a woman who was dying of cancer while you were waiting to take her place. Margaret's face twisted. I raised you, I sacrificed everything for you. I gave up my life to take care of another woman's child. You hated me from day one, I said quietly. And Dad. I turned to face my father again. You knew what she would do, didn't you? Helen warned you. The room went completely silent. Even the ambient noise seemed to disappear. My father's face crumbled in a way I had never seen before. His voice came out as a whisper. How did you know about that? I felt ice run through my veins. I didn't, until just now. Thank you for confirming it. I faced the crowd of my colleagues, my boss, the people who had gathered to celebrate my success. They deserved to know the truth too. My birth mother was dying of cancer. She used her last strength to beg my father not to let Margaret raise me. She knew exactly what would happen. She saw something in Margaret that my father refused to see. I paused to steady my voice. And 8 months after Helen died, my father married the woman Helen feared most and handed me over to her. For 33 years. I turned back to my father. Why did you do it? He couldn't look at me. His voice was barely audible. Because I was weak. I couldn't raise you alone. I was grieving, I was lost, and Margaret was there. She promised she would love you. I convinced myself she would change once she had her own child, once she felt like part of the family. He finally looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. By the time I saw what she was really doing to you, it was too late. I felt like it was my punishment. For betraying Helen, for choosing wrong. I let Margaret hurt you because I thought I deserved to suffer for what I'd done. I stared at him for a long moment. So you let her punish me for your mistake. He had no answer. There was no answer that could make sense of sacrificing your own daughter to pay for your own guilt. I turned to Margaret one final time. She was standing alone now. No one had moved to comfort her. No one had spoken in her defense. You spent 33 years trying to destroy me, I said. Not because I did anything wrong, but because every time you looked at me you saw Helen, the woman my father actually loved. The woman you could never be no matter how hard you tried. I took a step closer to her. You needed me to fail. You needed me to be broken and alone and worthless. Because if I succeeded, if I was happy, it would prove that Helen's blood was stronger than your hatred. It would prove that you spent your entire marriage competing with a ghost and losing. Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Here's the truth, I said. I didn't fail. Helen's daughter didn't fail. I became a vice president despite every obstacle you put in my way. I built a life despite every relationship you poisoned. I'm standing here whole and successful and surrounded by people who respect me, and that's what you can't stand. I let the silence hang for a moment before I delivered the words I had been waiting my whole life to say. I was never damaged goods. I was just raised by people who were afraid of the truth. The room seemed to exhale. I looked around and saw Tyler standing frozen near the back wall. For the first time in his life, he wasn't jumping to his mother's defense. He wasn't making excuses or calling me dramatic. He just stood there processing the fact that everything he thought he knew about his family was a lie. I felt someone move to stand beside me. It was James. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just positioned himself at my shoulder like a silent guardian, letting me know I wasn't alone. Margaret looked around the room, desperately searching for allies, for someone to call me a liar, for anyone to take her side. But there was no one. My colleagues stared at her with a mixture of horror and disgust. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place by the weight of what they had just witnessed. In that silence, 33 years of carefully constructed lies collapsed into rubble. My father sat with his head in his hands, weeping quietly. Margaret stood alone in the middle of the room, stripped of every pretense she had ever worn, and I stood tall, holding the truth that had finally set me free. The truth was finally out. But I wasn't done, because the box my father would bring me the next week would reveal something even Margaret didn't know she had stolen. And it would change everything. Within 2 weeks of that night, Margaret's carefully curated world began to collapse. I didn't have to do anything. I didn't make phone calls or send emails or post anything online. 40 people had witnessed her public breakdown, and word spread like wildfire on its own. The truth has a way of traveling once it's finally set free. It doesn't need help. It just needs an open door. Margaret's friends stopped returning her calls. The women she had lunched with for decades, the ones who had smiled at her charity events and complimented her garden, were suddenly always busy. Her garden club developed scheduling conflicts whenever she tried to attend. The book club she had been part of for 20 years quietly removed her from the group chat. One by one, the pillars of her social life crumbled. But the biggest blow came from the Winter Charity Gala Committee. Margaret had served on that organizing board for 15 years. It was the position she was most proud of, the crown jewel of her social identity. They sent her a polite email requesting her resignation, citing a need to restructure the leadership team. Everyone knew the real reason. No one wanted to stand beside a woman who had publicly called her stepdaughter damaged goods and been exposed as a decades-long liar. Tyler called me about a week after the party. His voice was shaky, uncertain. "Mom won't stop crying, Matt," he said. "She says everyone's abandoned her. No one will answer her phone calls anymore. She doesn't leave the house. I listened to him describe her suffering, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, just emptiness. This wasn't my revenge. I hadn't destroyed Margaret. She had destroyed herself over 33 years. Brick by brick, lie by lie. The truth just let everyone finally see what she had built. 1 week after the party, my father appeared at my apartment door. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 7 days. His hands trembled as he held an old cardboard box covered in dust. "Helen left these for you," he said. "I should have given them to you decades ago. I was too ashamed." I took the box and carried it to my kitchen table. The first thing I saw when I opened it was photographs, dozens of them, and in every single one I saw myself. Helen Porter had my eyes, my smile, the shape of my face. Looking at her was like looking into a mirror that reached back through time. For 33 years, I had wondered where I came from. Now I knew. I came from this beautiful woman who smiled at the camera like she had endless hope for the future. Underneath the photographs, I found letters, 3 of them written in careful handwriting on yellowed paper. The first 2 were love letters from a dying mother to a baby daughter she knew she would never see grow up. I couldn't bring myself to read them fully, not yet. The emotions were too raw, and I needed time to sit with them properly. I set them aside carefully, knowing I would return to them when I was ready. The third letter was not addressed to me. It was addressed to my father, dated 1 week before Helen's death. "David, if anything happens to me, promise you'll keep Vanessa away from Margaret. She's always hated me. She once told me she would make sure any child of mine learned their place. I'm begging you, don't let her raise our daughter, anyone but her." I read that letter 3 times. Each reading hit harder than the last. Helen had known. She had seen exactly what Margaret was capable of, and she had tried to warn my father with her dying breath. He had ignored her. He had married Margaret anyway and handed me over anyway. I looked up at my father. He was crying silently. "She knew," I said quietly. "She knew exactly what would happen to me." He nodded, unable to speak. At the very bottom of the box, I found something else. 3 yellowed envelopes, still sealed, unopened, addressed to me at our old family home. The first was from Stanford University. The postmark was dated the spring of my senior year. The second was from UC Berkeley. The third was from Columbia. I opened them one by one with trembling hands. Acceptance letters, all 3 of them. "Congratulations, Miss Lowe. We are pleased to offer you admission." I had gotten in. All 3 schools had wanted me. I never received them. I spent my senior year checking the mailbox every day, waiting for responses that never came. I convinced myself I wasn't good enough. I went to a state school because I thought it was the only place that would take me. I worked twice as hard, took on mountains of student debt, and spent years clawing my way up from the bottom. Margaret had stolen these letters. She had hidden them and let me believe I was a failure. She watched me struggle for years and said nothing. She saw me drown in debt and feel grateful for opportunities that should have been beneath me, and she smiled. I stared at those acceptance letters for a long time. Stanford, Berkeley, Columbia. I thought about the trajectory my life could have taken, the connections I could have made, the years of struggle I could have avoided. "She knew I was good enough," I said quietly. "That's why she had to stop me." I didn't cry. I understood something new in that moment. Margaret wasn't just cruel, she was afraid that if I succeeded, everyone would see how much I resembled Helen. My failure was the only way Margaret could feel like she had won her invisible war against a ghost. I turned to my father. "You knew about the college letters?" He nodded slowly. "I found them years later, in Margaret's closet. By then you were already graduated, already working. I told myself it was too late to matter." "You told yourself it was too late so you wouldn't have to do anything." He had no response. There was no response that could justify 33 years of cowardice. I stood up from the table. "I need time, maybe years. If you want any relationship with me going forward, you'll start by telling Tyler the whole truth. All of it. That's not optional." He nodded and left without another word. The next day I wrote a letter to Margaret. Not a confrontation, just a statement. "I've spoken with a lawyer. What you said at my promotion party in front of dozens of witnesses meets the legal definition of defamation. I could sue you. The damages could be significant. I'm choosing not to. Not because I forgive you, but because watching you live with the consequences is enough. You'll spend the rest of your life knowing that everything you did, every lie you told, every happiness you destroyed, it wasn't enough. Helen's daughter is still standing, and everyone knows what you really are. Tyler reached out a few days later. His voice was different, smaller. I don't blame you, I told him. You didn't know, but I need to know now that you do know who are you going to be. There was a long pause. I don't know yet. I'm still processing all of this. That's fair. When you figure it out, you know how to reach me. In the weeks that followed, I found myself slowly returning to normal life. Work continued, meetings happened, projects moved forward, but something had shifted inside me. I was no longer carrying the weight of secrets that weren't mine to keep. I was no longer wondering what was wrong with me. I finally knew the truth, and the truth had set me free. I still hadn't read Helen's personal letters to me. They sat in my bedside drawer waiting. I knew that when I finally opened them, it would be a moment I could never take back. I wanted to be ready. I wanted to give my mother's words the space and attention they deserved. Everyone told me forgiveness was the only path to healing, but I had found a different kind of healing, one that didn't require me to absolve the people who broke me. Some wounds don't need forgiveness to close. They just need the truth. 8 months have passed since that night. 8 months since I stood in front of 40 colleagues and read the truth out loud. 8 months since my life split into before and after. My career continues to flourish. The colleagues who witnessed that night don't pity me. They respect me more. They saw a woman who stood her ground with grace under fire. They saw someone who refused to crumble when she was supposed to break. My boss Richard told me recently that my composure that evening said more about my leadership than any presentation I've ever given. I'm not sure I agree with him, but I understand what he means. Sometimes strength isn't about what you achieve. It's about what you survive. James and I are taking things slow. He knows everything about my past now, every ugly detail, every scar Margaret left behind. He didn't run, he didn't look at me differently. He just held my hand and said he was glad I told him. For the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm not bracing myself for someone to leave. I'm just letting myself be loved by someone who actually sees me. I moved into a new apartment 2 months ago. It's smaller than what I could afford, but it's mine. Every photo on the wall is one I chose. Every piece of furniture is something I picked out myself. Every memory in these rooms is one I made. There are no ghosts here, no whispers of inadequacy, no reminders of all the ways I was told I wasn't enough. Just space, clean, quiet space where I can finally breathe. I keep Helen's letter in a drawer by my bed. I've read it dozens of times now, so many times that I've memorized every word, but I still pull it out sometimes just to see her handwriting, just to touch the paper she once touched. My darling Vanessa. I won't get to see you grow up. That breaks my heart more than dying does, but I want you to know that you were wanted. You were loved. You were the best thing I ever did. Whatever life brings you, remember that you came from love. You are love. Nothing anyone tells you about where you came from can change that. Be brave, my sweet girl. Be kind, and never let anyone make you feel small. Love forever, Mom. I don't need to search for more information about Helen. I don't need to track down distant relatives or visit a grave. This letter is enough. She loved me. She tried to protect me. Her last thoughts were of me. That's all I need to know. Helen was right to be afraid of Margaret, but she was also right about something else. Her daughter was brave. Her daughter was kind. And her daughter never let them make her small, not permanently. 3 months after the party, my father moved out of the house. Not divorce. He wasn't brave enough for that. But separation. He lives in a small apartment now on the other side of town. He calls me once a week. I don't always answer, but sometimes I do. We're not close, and I don't know if we ever will be. But he's trying in his own limited way. He's telling Tyler the truth slowly, piece by piece. It's breaking the family Tyler thought he knew. But some things need to break before they can be rebuilt. Margaret still lives in the big house, but without my father's income, without friends, without her charity boards and garden clubs and social standing, she's just a woman alone with 4 walls and 33 years of choices she can't take back. I heard from Tyler that she doesn't leave the house much anymore. The invitations stopped coming. The phone stopped ringing. The life she built on lies collapsed when the foundation was exposed. I don't all feel sorry for her, but I don't feel angry anymore either. Margaret is living the consequences of her own actions. That's not revenge. That's just reality. The universe has a way of balancing things out eventually. I didn't have to destroy her. I just had to tell the truth. The truth did the rest. 5 months after the party, Tyler showed up at my door unannounced. He looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, the look of someone who hasn't slept properly in months. I almost didn't recognize him. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him enter. We sat across from each other in my living room, two strangers who had lived in the same house for 18 years. "I spent my whole life believing Mom's version," he said. "That you were difficult, that you pushed everyone away, that you were jealous of me. I never asked why you were distant, I just assumed you were the problem. And now," he took a deep breath, "now I know I was wrong. I know Mom lied about everything. I know she stole your college letters, poisoned your relationships, made your life hell. Because she was jealous of a dead woman." He paused, struggling with the next words. "And I know I benefited from all of it. Every time she tore you down, I got built up. I got the praise, the support, the belief in me that should have been shared between us. I got the childhood you deserved." I didn't say anything, I just let him talk. "I don't know how to make that right," he continued. "I don't know if I can. But I want to try. I want to actually know my sister, if you'll let me." I looked at this man who had been a stranger to me my entire life. He wasn't the enemy, he was just another casualty of Margaret's war against a ghost. He had been shaped by her lies, just like I had been shaped by her cruelty. The only difference was that her lies had lifted him up while they pushed me down. I didn't hug him, not yet, but I opened the door wider. "Come in, let's talk." We talked for 4 hours that night, real talk for the first time in our lives. He told me about the guilt he felt, the confusion, the way his whole understanding of our family had shattered. I told him about the birthdays that were forgotten, the achievements that were ignored, the relationships that were poisoned before they could bloom. By the time he left, we had covered more ground than we had in 3 decades of living under the same roof. At the door, he turned back. "I'm sorry it took me 32 years to see you. I'm sorry it took 33 years of lies to make you look. It's not forgiveness, not yet, but it's a start." That evening after Tyler left, I sat alone with Helen's letter. I thought about the woman I never got to know, the mother who loved me fiercely, who saw the danger coming, who tried to protect her daughter from beyond the grave. I thought about Margaret, who spent 33 years trying to erase that love, and I realized something profound. Margaret failed, not because I became a vice president, not because I found James or rebuilt my relationship with Tyler or proved everyone wrong. Margaret failed because Helen's love survived. It survived 33 years of lies and sabotage and cruelty. It survived Margaret's best efforts to destroy it. And now finally I can feel it. I can feel my mother's love reaching across decades, across death itself, to hold me. People ask if I regret exposing everything publicly. I don't. For 33 years, I kept quiet to protect a family that was never really mine. I stayed silent while a woman who hated me told the world I was damaged. I accepted less because I had been taught I deserved less. Helen was right to be afraid of Margaret. But she was also right about me. I was brave, I was kind, and I never let them make me small, not permanently. I fold her letter carefully and place it back in the drawer, not as a wound, not as a weapon, but as proof. Some love is stronger than lies. Some truth is worth the fire it takes to speak it. And sometimes the family you were born into isn't the one you were meant to keep. It's just the one that teaches you what family should never be. I am Vanessa Lowe. I am Helen Porter's daughter, and I am finally completely free. Vanessa's story is one that many of us recognize, even if we have never lived through something so extreme. It is a story about the damage that silence can do. It is a story about what happens when we believe the lies we are told about ourselves. And most importantly, it is a story about the power of truth to set us free, even when that truth arrives decades too late. If there is one lesson we can take from Vanessa's journey, it is this. The people who try to make you feel small are often the ones who are most afraid of your greatness. Margaret did not hate Vanessa because Vanessa was flawed. She hated her because Vanessa was a living reminder of everything Margaret could never be. Every cruel word, every sabotaged opportunity, every poisoned relationship was not evidence of Vanessa's weakness. It was evidence of Margaret's fear. So many of us have been told we are not good enough, We have been told we are too much or too little. We have been told that our dreams are unrealistic, that our ambitions are foolish, that we should be grateful for scraps instead of reaching for the feast we deserve. And too often those voices come from the people who are supposed to love us most: parents, spouses, siblings, the ones whose opinions we trust without question. But here is the truth that Vanessa finally learned: you do not have to accept someone else's definition of who you are. You do not have to carry shame for wounds you did not create. And you do not have to forgive people who have never apologized just to prove that you have healed. Healing does not require forgiveness. Sometimes healing simply requires the truth. Sometimes it requires boundaries. Sometimes it requires walking away from people who refuse to see you clearly. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in Vanessa's story, I want you to know something. You are not damaged goods. You never were. The people who told you that were speaking from their own fear, their own insecurity, their own inability to handle your light. Their words say everything about them and nothing about you. It is never too late to reclaim your story. It is never too late to speak your truth. And it is never too late to build a family of your own choosing, made up of people who see you, respect you, and love you exactly as you are. Thank you for listening to this story today. If it touched your heart or made you think about your own journey, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of Vanessa's story resonated with you most. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who hurt you? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your past? Your stories matter, and this community is a safe space to share them. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We share stories of strength, resilience, and justice every week, stories about ordinary people who find extraordinary courage in their darkest moments. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, some love is stronger than lies. Your truth is worth telling.